All right. Welcome to what we'll call episode 18 of the Athletic Philosopher Podcast. I am your host, Jordan Goldstein, former sport history, philosophy, sociology professor, current fitness coach, life coach, endurance training coach, all of the above, none of the above. And I've got with me a very special guest. This is Brent from the Aiming Up podcast. And I've been lucky enough to be on Brent's podcast a couple times discussing the
Twice.
philosophy. Twice, yeah, discussing the philosophy of sport. And so often when we get into these philosophical discussions, it seems like by the time we just get started, we have to hit stop on the podcast episode. So I'm really honored that Brent volunteered to come on. It seems like the people who are getting on this podcast are the ones who say, "I'm coming on." Like you, like they just sort of like bully their way right into the screen, and I really appreciate that. I really do. And our talk today is just going to be another one of these open-ended, broad philosophical explorations, and we'll get into kind of a Socratic back and forth. We'll get into a dialogue. We'll try to keep it above board in terms of not too many definitions or impenetrable concepts. Um, but as I oftentimes try to always steer these conversations towards taking action. So it's like exploring ideas is great, but if we're not able to translate that into a way to live a better life, then we're not doing much of anything that's valuable, both in terms of our conversation and certainly not much of value to the people that are listening. So with that, thank you, Brent, for coming on. And if there's anything you want to say to the beautiful people out there watching or listening before I open this guy off, now would be your chance.
No. Thanks for having me. I'm really honored to be on your show. We've had a great conversation in the past, a couple of them, and I think there's a ton of value we can bring to the world here. So I really appreciate you partnering with me in that, whether it's on my show or yours.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And what I really appreciate about Brent is his open mind and open heart when it comes to the world of ideas. And I believe you consider yourself a lay philosopher, yeah?
Yeah, sure.
So somebody
Barely,
who's
but
not I was listening and it's funny because the first guest I had on, Patrick Flynn, actually we all kind of like connected a little bit, and I was listening to your podcast, and
man.
he's an actual philosopher. Like he's getting his PhD in philosophy as we speak, and he has a philosophy podcast, and he writes philosophy books and articles, and he I think put you in your place when he's like, "No, dude, you're just a philosopher." He's like, "You're just a philosopher." So this is really it's really cool.
For sure. I don't mean to denigrate myself, but I do. I think that conversation with Pat really highlighted the limits of my abilities in philosophy, which is fine. That's why we have these conversations. You need to talk to somebody who maybe is a bit more rigorous than you, a little bit more educated, thought about, because it's very hard. Like I talked about in the episode with him, to think especially about these major, existential issues. And so I sort of tongue in cheek denigrate myself. Hey, I'm a lay philosopher. Don't have any formal training, but anyone can be a philosopher. It's just a question, of how, how far we've gone. It's almost like sports too, right? Like, are you a beginner runner? Are you an intermediate? Are you advanced? I'm intermediate somewhere, but I enjoy having the discussions and I love doing it in public. And so, like just let the chips fall where they may. I love these conversations. It's a hobby of mine. I really enjoy doing it, and I wish more people spent time, interrogating these questions.
Interrogate is such a big time word. It's such a big time word. And I think the way I just want to kick this off is you mentioned it's just sort of you see like almost like a natural connection there between the world of philosophy or exploring ideas or being courageous to explore ideas and sports in terms of like my relative position or my relative performance. So I'll just ask you, what do you see as the connection between sport and philosophy? And let's just blow the door open and see where that takes us.
It's easy, honestly, to me. The connection is they're hard. Both of them are difficult, particularly when you're starting out, right? Because they both require expenditure of effort. What one is primarily physical, although sport obviously requires a ton of mental effort as well. Whereas philosophy is strictly in the realm of mental effort, right? And they're both rigorous. They require effort. You can't fake it. If you get into a race with other runners, like you know where you stand, like you have a clearly defined positionality. And I think in philosophy it's the same boat. Like if you are a lay philosopher or a beginner and you jump into the deep end with a PhD person, you're going to realize that you are completely outclassed. And that's cool, right? Because it gives you something to aim at regardless of which track you're on. Like, hey, these runners, like, hey, I'm looking at Jordan, he's way better than me, but I have someone to chase. And I think in the philosophical realm, we're in that boat too. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants. We all have role models to look up to, and I think those two, they track perfectly almost. Like I see so many parallels between the two. They just require a repeated investment every day, getting up. Whether you're wrestling with ideas or whether you're wrestling with your own body and the limitations and trying to progress. It's the same thing you're doing, right? I think they're very, very closely aligned.
Yeah, I love that. And I love how you connected them through this idea of hard, right? That they're hard. These are not easy endeavors. And the people who will say, like, aspire to engage with these activities, like the most of their value, like to the depth of their value, right? Like they appreciate the hard. Like a philosopher loves being questioned. They love when somebody pokes a little bit of a hole in their argument that they had never considered, because it exposes a flaw or a weakness in their thinking that they are grateful. They're
Hmm.
grateful to have it exposed. Just like if I'm an athlete and I'm training for a race and, all of a sudden my hamstring just sort of like flares up a little bit, I shouldn't be angry. I should use that as information to say, do some lunges, right? Like work the back half of your legs, get stronger so that you don't have that weakness that then exposes itself, say like in the race or in the competition context. But I want to challenge you a little bit here. I want to challenge you a little bit on what you said about a beginner jumping into the ring with an expert. Like I'm a PhD in history, and one of the things that I've observed, certainly from my time inside of the academy, is that a lot of experts pose as experts but live as sophists. They live as
Mm.
sophists. Okay, so what's a sophist? A sophist is a person who's really good at arguing, but they're not good at actually presenting the truthful information. So the sophist is someone who might use emotion or guilt or persuasion as opposed to like rational facts and logic to prove which argument is the better argument. So they don't utilize philosophy as a search for truth. They utilize philosophy as a means of status or gaining power and authority. And they don't actually care what's right or wrong in the argument, they just want to win. Like a good way to think about a sophist would actually be to think about a trial lawyer. Like a trial
Hmm.
lawyer, their job is to win or lose. Their job isn't necessarily to determine the truth. Like if I'm a criminal defense lawyer, I am hired to get my client off of the charges. Even if I know they're guilty, I've been hired to point out flaws in the legal system. Hey, you didn't read my client Miranda rights. Doesn't matter that he did the crime or not. Now he goes free. And I love criminal defense lawyers. Like they get crapped on a lot, but that's an extraordinarily important role in the criminal justice system. But I just there was this um, episode kind of like in the running world on Twitter and on X the last week, which I think really highlights why we shouldn't be afraid to challenge experts, no matter where we are, right? And I think that's kind of what I want to talk about. It's yeah, if I'm not a philosopher, if I'm not like an ex like a high quality athlete, that shouldn't stop me from wanting to engage. It shouldn't stop me from wanting to question and challenge. And people out there might kind of know what I'm talking about. There was this one running journalist. He wrote for Trail Running magazine, and he had this tweet that sort of poked holes and threw some shade at like a well-known running influencer who I'm friendly with. And this guy's tweet was something like, saw this influencer post about how he had run like 10,000 or like 1,000 hours or 10,000 hours or something it's 10,000 miles in the last like 10 years or something as a runner. And he said, that's like not even as much as a JV cross country athlete runs, and nobody should be taking advice from this guy. And this is a guy who's got like his marathon time in his bio. He's a runner. He writes for Trail Runner magazine. So he's like the expert, right, of the running world.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody that matters tore this guy apart. They're like, what are you doing, bro? Like, you are about to crap on someone. You're about to denigrate somebody who has improved their life through fitness and is trying to help other people by sharing the knowledge that he's got on his own experience. And the running influencer is Jeremy Singh. And I invited Jeremy to the Prairie on Fire that I ran last year, the Backyard Ultra. He showed up. He was great. Lots of smiles. Didn't have the best running day. But you know, we've talked, and he's a great guy, and he's doing it all for the right reasons. And just because somebody is an expert doesn't mean they're utilizing their knowledge for the best. And that guy to me is like a classic example of what a sophist does, where he's just like punching down on people and making them feel bad about not being smart enough or not being fast enough or not having run enough miles in order to even enter into the conversation. And I just want to use that example to tell people, you want to question an expert in any field, go right ahead. But kind of like as you pointed out earlier, that might expose your own ignorance. So you have to be courageous when doing it, but don't let the titles of anybody stop you from asking questions or determining your own value of what that experience is.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I'm not saying that as a warning to people to don't get in the ring with these folks. I think it's actually more of an encouragement because you should get into the ring with these people, surround yourself with people who are probably better than you because you're going to learn something from them, whether that be in a philosophical discussion or physical interaction. Like you're going to pick up, you know, the way it is, man. I've been a runner my whole life. You talk to people like, hey, I'm actually using these socks. They're performing better for this reason, or I tried this type of shoe and actually it sucked. And here's the problem: the tongue is all fucked up and it caused me blisters. Like you're gonna get all of these nuggets, man. And you're gonna be better off for it. So it's like, yes, just be okay with like there's gonna be a differential in performance. Be completely okay with that because the intention is like to get better. And if you're gonna get better, the only way you're going to get better is by being around better people.
And then being willing to learn from your own mistakes through the process.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. Sport and
you gotta have
philosophy
humility.
have a lot in common.
For sure.
Let's speak on humility for a second there.
Well, I think a lot of times, I don't know if it's humility necessarily. Like it is important to be humble, be teachable, to be like, okay, I am where I am, and not to elevate yourself. But also the flip side of that, I think sometimes the reason people aren't appropriately humble is fear of the other, right? Like maybe this Jeremy guy that's going to talk shit, or somebody that's in that same boat where people are insecure about their abilities, and so they try to either, you know, like they're not you know, open to criticism or feedback because they want to appear better than they actually are, because it's a thing of they're worried about the criticism. I think that is a big problem. I think ego with people in general is just a big problem because we're so afraid of being judged and what the other people around us are going to think of us. And it's like, dude, no, just I loved, you know, let's talk about sport, man. Did you watch the Tyson Jake Paul fight?
No, I was happily sleeping in my bed, not watching it.
Man, I was thinking about you the entire time. I watched the documentary, the lead up to it, and I've seen Tyson's arc. I'm an 80s kid, right? So I watched him in real time, you know, the rise, the fall, the prison thing, the reclamation project, and then seeing him on Rogan talking about doing 5-MeO DMT, the toad venom, right? Like, and him being like having that epiphany mediated by a psychedelic experience that's like, no, you're nothing, right? The disillusion of his ego, and then seeing this person who was all ego. And he suffered all of the slings and arrows that come with that high ego, and then to have his ego completely dissolved and have him in the interview leading up to one of the biggest fights of the year saying, I'm nothing. I don't know if you saw, there's this beautiful interview he did with like
the legacy one. Yeah.
The 12-year-old girl asking him this question. Yeah. And he's like, I'm nothing. I'm dust. And I'm like, Yes, that's exactly it. And if you conceptualize yourself this way, you're not going to fall into those traps that are associated with ego. You're going to have an appropriate level of humility. You're not going to be afraid to not be good enough. And you can just focus on looking at yourself yesterday and am I better or worse today than I was yesterday? And I think that's really the appropriate frame for any endeavor.
Yeah. And when we're trying to think about the connections between philosophy and sport, it's something about like a revelation of truth, right? Like a
Sure.
revelation of truth is the aim of both of these endeavors, clearly like different elements of truth. And I really like that idea of dissolving the ego initially, but it's not something that I feel should be completely removed from our lives. If evolution as a principle like holds, then the things that we have inside of us, like we still have them for a reason. So there has to be a kind of a positive element of the ego. And rather than dissolving the ego, I like to talk about the idea of harnessing the ego and steering it more appropriately, and then subjecting the ego to the truth, which is where like humility comes from, I think. Um, and I think sport and philosophy are both brilliant in properly contextualizing the ego because the ego is great. The ego is allows me to aspire. The ego allows me to dream. It allows me to be determined. It's my ambition, but it shouldn't be selfish, right? That's the harnessing
Mm,
of the ego. That's the harnessing. This is the difficult part of dealing with the ego because it's like how do I turn it on, but like make sure it doesn't overdo it, right? Because what does the ego want more than anything? Just to be confirmed. It just wants to be right.
right.
So this is really tricky. So what we effectively have to do, and I think this is one of the beautiful utilities of both philosophy and sport, is this ultimate like it's this ultimate training ground for us to properly interact with the ego and figure out ways in which we can tamper it down to the correct ability. And that's through like a submission to truth. Like that's what it sounds like. That's what it sounds like to me. That's like, I've got a brilliant argument, but you just asked a question that I've never considered, right? So I get properly brought down a little bit. Oh, I said I was going to go out and run 100 miles and I only ran 87 and a half. Okay, properly tamped down, right? It's the proper feedback that the ego needs to incorporate it, right? Or that yourself needs to incorporate. Like and it's not perfect. Nothing is perfect. But the the answer to a sort of like an overactive ego isn't to kill the ego in my sense either. That's one extreme. That's one extreme to the other.
Yeah, and I don't think you can kill it. And when I say kill it, I just essentially mean having it tamped down in a big way. Because I think the problem with ego is the danger with it is too much at all times. Because I
Mm.
don't think even if you because I've had some deep psychedelic experiences that have humbled me completely, broke down the ego, all of the things it comes back. I think you're right. It is part of our biology, and it is one of those things that you, no matter how hard you try, keeps coming back and coming back. And so it is this constant, fight with the ego. I think you have easier times than others, and I do agree. I think you can harness it in the moment. For example, I've been in races before, and it's like, motherfucker, I'm not letting this guy beat me. Like, and even though you can tell yourself all day long, I want to be better than me yesterday, and I'm only competing with myself. Guess what? If you're in competition, anyone who's been a serious athlete, and one way or another, I don't care. You are going to be, I want to beat this person at times. And that propels you forward. I think rivalries are very, very important. But I think it's a matter of, at the end of it, being a good sport, right? Being a gracious winner or loser. And then when you're done with it, if let's say you have beaten this person that you historically couldn't beat, and you finally got him, cool. Have your celebration, but at the end, put the ego back in check. I think there's always going to be this wrestling that we do with ego, no matter how hard you try to kill it.
Yeah, you used a lot of really big time words, and it sort of puts into my mind like why we should want to be philosophers when it comes to our training. And what I mean by that is, I want to utilize the training and the competition to learn things about myself. I want to use training as a modality towards self knowledge.
Mm,
What a lot of people do with training is they aim it at self validation or self confirmation. as their primary aim, which is just fulfilling the ego, which is like, I want to work out so I can have big muscles so that when I look in the mirror, I feel really great about myself. And it's like,
A little
that's
narcissistic,
good.
yeah.
That's good, but it's pretty shallow. Yeah. Like, that's pretty
Mm.
shallow. That's a pretty shallow way to go about things, as opposed to, I want to throw myself into like a competition that's a little bit maybe too difficult for me in order to get completely exposed. In order to get completely exposed. And then all I've got to do is look at the pieces of true knowledge that have been like left in the wake of this experience. And I've got to be strong and courageous enough to incorporate the lessons and the growth that I need to into my persona, into my character, moving forward. Right. So when I say like be a philosopher of sport, everybody out there, it's aiming your training towards acquiring truthful self knowledge. Just
Mm.
like in philosophy, I'm interested in a dialogue or a conversation where we can suss out the differences between one assertion and then a counter assertion. So Brent and I have been doing this, right? I've thrown out this idea. He throws out this idea of the ego. I come back with, here's a counter, and he's like, yeah, actually, that's really close to what I even meant in the first place. We were just
Mm.
using different words. So we refine, right, through this back and forth, through this beautiful volley. Like if we just think about a tennis volley, for example, like that's one of the beautiful like metaphors for a Socratic dialogue is this
100%.
just this beautiful back and forth between us. And what I want people to recognize is that we want to do that with our own training. I want to volley back and forth with with the trail run that I'm about to go on later this afternoon. I want knowledge about myself. I want to see that I'm sitting in my car procrastinating for 10 minutes after I've driven to the trail, that I say to everybody, hey, I love trail running. I want to go trail running all the time. And then when I get to the trail, it's like, I actually don't want to go out there right now. And I have to notice that about myself. And I've got to be honest about, what does this mean? It just means that we all fight through resistance. There's always resistance. Most of the time when we go to work out, we're not just like fired out of a gun. And it's like, I can't wait to get that barbell on my shoulders, or I can't wait to go, put my feet in the mud on this trail run. It's, I got to figure out how I got to get out there. Like, and that's where these deep lessons of self really come through.
Yeah, I agree. You got to touch on a couple of things that are important there. I think philosophically, that's the concept of the dialogos, right? Like the both of us, the back and forth. That's awesome. But you raised an important thing that I didn't think about before. There's actually a form of dialogos that happens inside our own brain, right? Like you called out. Like I've been on these runs before. Like I used to run cross country, and that's a fast pace, man. I'm talking sub 5 minute miles, and you're pushing yourself as hard as you can. And then you have that moment where your body's like, hey, man, slow down. And your brain's like, no, fuck you. I'm going to keep going. And you actually have this dialogos with yourself, which is wild. And you
Yes.
called out the person that immediately came to mind was David Goggins. If you listen to him, he'll say, I wake up in the morning sometimes and I stare at my running shoes for 45 minutes. And I'm like, this is the hardest motherfucker on the whole planet. And if he is struggling for 45 minutes to lace up his shoes, like this struggle is real and it affects everybody, man. I don't care who you are.
Right. And this is exactly why sport can become this incredible, like almost like laboratory for for experimenting with self knowledge that is true enough, or it's just true that we can actually look at applying those lessons that we find out about ourselves to other areas of my life. So if I recognize that everybody sees me as the person who just wants to go run, but you know, whatever, 5 times out of like one out of every 2 times, I look at the running shoes with a sense of dread, with a sense of dread.
Mm-hmm.
Am I now strong enough to listen to what I need to overcome? And if I actually get into tune with that signal, how did I overcome that? Why didn't I just stay in bed? Why did I turn the car off, put the phone away, get outside into it's going to be like 35 degrees and raining when I go out later this afternoon. Like, nobody wants to go out there. I'm praying for snow. That's how bad that weather is. It's like, I know I want the snow. I want it right now. The snow is clean and pure. This is like
Yep.
awful. This is the worst. I'm going to notice, what am I telling myself? What is moving me literally from inaction to action? What's pulling me? And if it's strong enough to get me out of my seat to go do something that's really difficult, that I have to bear myself open to the truth, can I not do that in other areas of my life? Can I not find the courage to have that tough conversation with a colleague, a boss, a family member about setting a boundary about the way I'm being treated, or about standing up on my principles or my values, or taking a courageous leap and being creative, starting a podcast, a blog,
Hmm.
a side hustle, a business, like whatever it is that you are lacking, let's say the motion from thought to action. Sports become this incredible place where we are forcing ourselves into the world of action. And if I'm just noticing and being aware of the knowledge of myself that I'm gaining, that's like power. That's real power because it's self knowledge. And now I can utilize it on the way to what we call what, self mastery.
Sure, if there's such a thing.
It's a process. It's not an end goal. Self mastery is a process. You'll never be a self master because you're not perfect, because you're a person and you're infallible and you're imperfect by your nature. By your nature, you're imperfect. So the best we can do is sink into a process of aspiration, achievement, honesty, and humility and growth, right? Which is effectively how we move through both the worlds of philosophy and sports in the best way.
Yeah, agreed. Couldn't agree more.
There's something that stuck out to me too about our discussion about the ego and humility. And I think when we talk about sports and philosophy, here's one of the powerful ways in which the ego tricks us. Okay. And it uses the word humility to trick us. Right. And it says, we'll use your example of being a lay philosopher, right? I'm a lay philosopher. I'm putting a limit on my capability. So because I'm a lay
Mm.
philosopher, I can't go above this line. But do you know what's above that line? Responsibility, potential, difficulty, obligation, duty. So people use the word humility to trick themselves when they feel fear. Oh, I'm just a humble guy. I don't have the capability. But you're lying because you do have the capability. Like, you do have the, like, somebody out there listening is saying to themselves, like, maybe not exactly in these words, but we'll just use the running example because you talk about running. I talk about running. They're like, I could never be a runner. I
Mm.
could never be a runner. And it's like, no, you can't. And oh, I can't be a runner because I'm whatever, stocky. I'm a sprinter by nature. I don't want to do long distance, right? It's like, and I'm humble enough to recognize that I'm just not going to work well in that environment. And then it's like, you're just putting a limit so you don't have to try. You're just putting a limit on you so you don't have to try. And effectively, what you're now doing is lying to yourself about what you can accomplish. And we just substitute the word humility like far too many times, right? And I want people to appreciate the way, like, that's how powerful the ego is. It will take something that is good, put it into our minds, and literally substitute it out for something that's bad or limiting.
That's interesting. I wonder why our brains do that. I don't know if it's a self-protective mechanism to where, for example, you go into a race and you're like, I'm unsure of myself, so I want to put this low bar. Is it for other people to try to like limit expectations so maybe you could leap over that bar and surprise people, or is it something else? I'm trying to figure. Maybe it's depending on the situation, but I'm trying to think through the ways that might play out.
Yeah, it's definitely dependent on the situation. And it's when you say self protection or self preservation, that's like 1,000% what's going on, right? The ego wants to be confirmed, and it doesn't matter if what's happening to you is good or bad. It just wants to be confirmed. Having a congruent conception of myself that aligns with how I act in the world is most important than me actually living a good life, right? people sabotage themselves. People live in horrible and miserable conditions, and they never endeavor to get themselves out of it because it's easier just to stay mired in it, right? And be like, I am that person who can't get it done. I am the failure. I am the reject. And it's easier to live with that confirmation inside my mind than to do the difficult thing of aspiring to do something difficult, right? Like, one of the things we've been talking about a lot on our team is this like hero's journey, this arc, right? This wheel. Yep. And what does the hero do? The hero goes from the known into the unknown. They cross the threshold. People will do whatever they can to rationalize why they shouldn't cross the threshold. And one of the things that is a really good example of this in a race context is this idea of like, what is quitting? Like, what does quitting look like? And I'm going to put this in the context of like an endurance race, right? Because I do endurance. So if I'm running like a 50-mile race and I just want to complete the race, but I don't want to like injure myself, my brain is going to start interfering with the pain signals that are coming from my body and my aspirations to quit. So then it's like, oh, I feel this pain in my leg. I should quit because it's more important for me to go back to my family not injured than it is for me to push through. But then it's like, did I just put an artificial limit on myself? Mm-hmm. Is it really pain that's stopping me, or is it my fear of feeling the pain? And a lot of the times what people recognize, say after the fact, if they did maybe quit, they're like, I could have pushed through that. Mm-hmm. Or I wasn't even willing to try to push through that. Oh, so then it's like, yeah, my humility in terms of like managing my expectation and reputation, because when you tell any normal person you're going to go run a 50-mile race, what's their first reaction? Why do you hate yourself?
Yep.
What are you running away from? Why do you want to punish yourself? So then you modulate your own experience in the race to conform to their external expectations as a way to manage your own ego and reputation and your own external status to those people. Where like, yeah, it is stupid and crazy. And I didn't do that. I was a smart person in the race. Because if you go for it, and like I got a guy, we ran this Prey on Fire Backyard Ultra last year. He ran way more than he expected, right? Blew his Achilles up for a month. He's the only person in the race who did that. None of us went past that sort of physical place. Mm-hmm. We couldn't psychologically get ourselves to go into that pain area. And he did. And people on the outside might be like, why would you blow up your Achilles? Like, why would you put yourself in the physical pain like that? And the people in the race were like, shoot, why couldn't I do that? Why didn't I blow up my Achilles? You know, what prevented me from crossing that particular threshold? So that's just one example of how that idea of humility can be this artificial limiter and really like a stand-in for fear in a race context. But like, I hope what's happening in the minds and hearts of people out there listening is like, oh my gosh, I've so been limiting myself and tricking me into thinking it's humility.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I was thinking when you brought up sophistry, and I'm very familiar with the concept and how it's deployed in philosophical or argumentative circles. Politicians are the ultimate sophists. I'm like, sport seems to eliminate the possibility for sophistry because as you mentioned, if you are trying to kick the ball through the uprights, like that is a binary, you did it or you didn't do it, right? But you just actually raised a good place where sophistry might be able to be deployed, which is sort of post hoc. After the fact, this rationalization, I didn't do it because there's this sort of narrative that you can deploy to sort of excuse yourself. I'm not sure if that's technically sophistry, but it seems at least an analog to how it would be deployed in argumentative circles.
I think it's self-deception. It's a type of self-sophistry. You talked about the dialogos that happens inside of our minds in sport. So that gives us a chance like for sophistry to enter, for manipulation. So it's a way for us to win the argument without doing the hard thing to actually deserve to win the argument. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it seems preservative of the ego, right? Because I feel like that it's not necessarily, it might be, wrestling with yourself and not coming to terms with where you are with respect to mental toughness or the training that you didn't do that you should have done that you didn't do. Like, but I think it's more, I think it comes down to fear of judgment of other people. I really do. I think this is like the excuse that you deploy as to, why you struggled through this really hard thing. And I did, all this X, Y, and Z, but this, my thing was hurting, or I didn't want to get injured, or I've got this thing coming up and I didn't want to.
Yep.
I think there is something there, and that prohibits what we talked about, appropriate levels of humility through the experience. And boy, that ego, man, that is a tricky one.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a really interesting sort of take on what's going on and why we have those things. Like, because if I want to, like, I really like this idea of self-sophistry. If I want to convince somebody else in a bad argument, I've got to do it in an overly persuasive manner,
Hmm.
right? Like, I can't just rely on lies because they're gonna say, "Yeah, that's BS, bro." You're like, "Oh, I had to quit because my leg hurt," and you're like, "You're holding your left leg, and you told me it was your right leg that hurt." Like, something's not adding up, bro. Something's not adding up, right? Like, so you have to believe it yourself. You've got to become a believer in the lie. You have to become a believer in the fabrication so that you can then persuade other people. And like in a race context, it's like people think about their quitting story for the when they decide they quit in their mind, and then when they're walking in, they're like, "Hell, am I going to tell other people this?" And have so here's a really cool thing that we've figured out, right? Because I'm telling people, be a philosopher of activity. One of the really cool things that I've been doing this year is utilizing race experiences as my sort of like vantage, like as a coach on a team. I'm looking at everybody's race experiences and I'm like, that's my primary research.
Hmm.
And one of the things that has come to light, especially in these endurance race context, is this idea of ego management. And here's how it works. It's like we want credit for doing the hard thing, but we don't want to actually feel the difficulty of the hard thing. What we want to do is we want the shortcut. So it's like, I want to do a 100-mile race. I don't want to feel the pain at mile
Hmm.
70 and mile 80, though. What I want to do is just sidestep it, get to the finish line, and then have everybody think I am the hardest, most badass person in the world. But when I actually feel like the resistance and the wall, I'm not happy. I don't want to be feeling this. I don't want to feel the humility. I don't want to feel any of it. And it's like we sign up for these races. We're like, I can't wait to get to the pain cave. And then you hit the pain cave and you just want to get out of it as fast. You're like, oh, I didn't want to be
Hmm.
here. I don't want to be here at all. I just wanted the credit for signing up and having other people think I'm a badass and doing a hard thing.
Yep.
That's when that self dialogos begins in the brain. And this is like a very difficult place to be. And the ego is in like it's in scramble mode at this point because you're blowing it apart. You're literally blowing it apart with this reality of physical pain. That's why, like, when you say sophistry can't exist in sports, like, you're right, because there's the reality of the physical effort, right? This is why
Yep.
cheaters are so badly punished in sports.
Mm.
Like, everybody knows people in politics cheat. Do they ever get punished? No. They're the ultimate sophists, as you say. So everyone knows they lie. Everybody knows they cheat. And the ones that lie and cheat the most are rewarded.
Yep.
It's inverse in the world. It's inverse in the world of sports. You get a whiff that anybody cheated, you're like excommunicated for life from the world of sports. There's nothing worse than a cheater. There's nothing worse, and everybody recognizes that.
Yeah.
So it's like when we're talking about domains of truth, I really like how you pointed that out about sports.
Well, hey, this reminds me so much of an Alex Hormozy quote. I'm not sure if you know who he is, but he says, "Everybody wants what you've got when you're successful, right? That's implied, but nobody wants the what you had to go through to get there."
Yeah,
So
no,
true.
I agree. I agree. It's one of the things that I always say is there's no such thing as an overnight success.
Hmm.
People be like,
Yep.
"Oh, this guy came out of nowhere," and it's like, the classic example I use is Justin Bieber. They're like, where did this like 15-year-old kid come from? He's like an overnight sensation. It's like, actually, he's been practicing all of his instruments since he was 6. He was a street performer every weekend at Stratford, Ontario, like singing. He was making YouTube videos for years before any of the big producers found him and maybe destroyed him. But it's like, oh, where'd this kid come from? I wish I could just be discovered like after putting up some internet videos. Like This guy's already worked more in his life, but by the time he's 14, than most adults will work in their entire lives to do anything, right? So it's like nobody is an overnight success. Nobody is an overnight success. Everybody puts in tremendous amount of work, sacrifice, toil. We're recording a podcast now. Like I'll be lucky if 24 people listen to this. You know what I mean? Like, and that'll be a giant success. And that's completely small potatoes. And then, in 10 years, if I still do it and there's hundreds of people listening or whatever, thousands of people, they'll think, oh, I wish I could have a big successful podcast or whatever. And it's like, okay, well, go start a really shitty podcast that nobody listens to for 5 years. Then, then talk to me. You want to be a good runner? Be a terrible runner. Run slow, awful, grueling. Oh, I could barely even finish a mile. Great. Keep at it. In 2 years, you're going to be smoking 10 miles and feeling like you can go forever. Like, it's the same thing.
Yeah, people don't realize that success is logarithmic, right? Like the curve is the slope is so slight at first. It's this just flat curve, like you mentioned. You'll see this. You look at any metrics. I love Chris Williamson talks about this with his podcast. He got almost 3 million subs now, and he was talking about, in the early days, he'd go, weeks with 0 plays on his episodes. Everyone's curve is the same way, and this has been studied, right, across all types of domains. You're starting very, very slow. You have 3, 4, 5 years in. You feel like you're getting nothing, and then eventually that curve steeply shoots up, and that's where the overnight success comes in. Nobody ever sees the 5 years of work you put in to get up to that point, and nobody thinks about it. They just say, oh, Jordan just burst on the scene, he's just blowing up, and it's like, actually there's a whole ton of work that goes into it, and I know that's true for sport as well.
Oh yeah, and it's like you're gonna fly. It's amazing how this all works in the conversation. It's like you're gonna fly to Dubai to interview a monster guest for your podcast who talks about this all the time, Zuby. And it's like, where did Zuby start out, right? Now he's like one of the most high-profile influencers, like on Twitter. He's got a giant podcast. He's interviewing like Elon Musk on his podcast. This guy was a street rapper who was like literally selling CDs on the street for years and years and years and years and years, right? And then he's just like slowly building, and he posts about this all this time. It's like, it took me like 9 years to get my first 10,000 followers on X. It's like, so you're late to the party now if you think it's like just always been wins for me, right? And he's somebody who trains. He's somebody who knows that idea of progressive overload, right? In terms of like, he's a weightlifter.
Hey,
so
former world record holder. Former world record holder.
And it's just funny that like the thing that actually propelled him into like virality was him mocking the idea that sports don't relate truth.
Right.
Because he's like, watch me smash the women's deadlift record.
Yep.
Because this is 2019 and I'm still a sport history and philosophy prof. And I'm telling you, I'm watching the madhouse. I'm inside the madhouse. And I'm looking at these like policy directives that like these like nonprofits and academic institutions are about to go lobby the Canadian government to become like the law of the land in sport. And I'm like, you people are insane. So it's like, I've got a backseat view, and what they're doing in Canada, it's like anybody can participate in any sporting category they want. They just have to self-ID. And that goes all the way up to the highest competitive levels in the land. So it's like in the States, NCAA, I could go from the men's basketball team to the women's basketball team, and all I have to do is say I am a woman now. I don't have to be on any hormones. I don't have to do there's no physiological thing that I've got to do. I just have to say that I'm a woman, and I can just walk in. And that's what was going on in Canada at the time. So I'm thinking, this is where the culture war is going to be lost. These people are done. Like, because you're about to enter the world of truth, and you're about to get blown apart. And that's what Zuby did. He's like, oh, there's no biological differences between the performances between men and women in sport. Cool. I'm clearly this jacked dude. I'm just going to identify as a woman. And it's funny because like during that lift, I identify. So he's like, I'm not even a woman. Just during the lift, I identified during the woman. So I steal their glory, was nothing. And people resonated with that. It was so obvious, right? Sport was, I just knew it. I'm like, all this gender stuff, like, people are willing to go with it because it's diffuse and it's nuanced, and they're like willing to play around in the areas of gray. But when you come to sports, that's a black and white world, and nobody is going to tolerate men and women competing against each other. nobody is going to tolerate it. And lo and behold, I was right. And it's just so funny how like that Zuby incident brings about a lot of the things we're talking about, both in terms of like sticking on like a slow growth curve, how that works in sports, but also how that just works in any endeavor of life where we are expanding and extending ourselves like into an unknown domain.
Yeah, and it was cool seeing him rewarded with all the attention and having his thing blow up because of it. Because uh, as you mentioned, like with sport in particular, like truth is it's very black and white, reality, and then also having courage in the face of enormous social pressure. Because at the time we were in a little bit of a mania around some of these concepts and ideas, and it looks like the pendulum's swinging the other way now as things typically shake out. But to see somebody have courage to speak out and to do something that expose them to a lot of personal risk. It was very cool to see the reaction. I know people, have differing views on this, and some people hate him for it and all that stuff. But you have to at least admire courage to speak your mind and to stand behind your principles. That was a fun thing to watch.
Yeah, courage to live by the truth. Something like philosophy. Something like that, like a courage to submit yourself to the honesty and the truth of the argument or the refutation or the counterpoint, right?
Yep.
Or the clarification. Same thing in same thing in sport. And it's funny that you mentioned like the mania, because one of the places that the mania never was really happening was inside of my classrooms, like when I was teaching, because I
Mm.
was teaching all these athletes, dude. And
Oh, got it.
I was teaching all these ex-athletes, and I would ask them these questions. One of the questions I would ask would be, are there sports where men and women can compete against each other at the highest level? That was just a question I would just throw out there in my first year philosophy of sport class. And pretty much everyone was like, not combat sports.
Yeah, right.
And they're like, and no matter what, they'd be like, stretch it. I remember I mentioned like Serena Williams as being the greatest female tennis player, and I had someone from the cheap seats in the back of the class be like, greatest tennis player of all time. And then I just said, put her on a court with Djokovic and see what happens. Actually, put her on a court with
Well,
the 200 ranked, put her on a court with the 200 ranked male, which has happened,
it
and she got
happened. Yeah,
dummied.
smoked,
She got,
smoked.
and that's nothing against Serena Williams, but it's the biological difference between performance of men and women in sports. It's just
No,
there.
definitely no shade. I remember when that happened, and I was thinking, because Serena's awesome. Like, you would watch her perform, and relative to other
Queen.
females in the category, just crushing people. And you would think, like, okay, she's going to hang with the guys. And then you actually saw it happen. It was like, oh, there's levels here. This is a completely different thing here. That actually shocked me. That opened my eyes a little bit.
Well, yeah, it's like the United States women's national soccer team. They went and played an exhibition game against like a high school team in Texas, and they got destroyed
Hmm.
by 15-year-olds. Dude, I remember my own experience. I was 13. I was just playing on a rep soccer league, a soccer team in my city. We were good. We were probably like the second or third best team in our city, which is about a 350,000 person city. So like that's pretty good. But in our same club, 3 years older than us, the girls were the national champions. They were the best. If I was under 13, they were under 16. They were the best U16 girls soccer team in all of Canada. And we dummied them. Dummied them. Because sometimes we'd have to share the same like pitch for practice, and we'd scrimmage,
Right, right.
and we would smoke them. The coach was so angry. He literally like brought in ringers from all over Canada, scheduled an exhibition match when half of our team was away, and like they beat us by 1 goal. And he's like on the sidelines, like, yeah, yeah. And it's like, you totally lost the plot. You totally lost
Right.
the plot, bro.
There's
So
the
it's like,
ego again.
but the point isn't to be like men are great and women aren't great at sports. It's that sports is the ultimate place of honesty. It's the
Mm.
one cultural activity where objective reality is so pronounced that we cannot rationalize it away. Like, I've used sports as these places of like a creative expression where we can have like artistic merit and an artistic kind of passion that drives us forward. And ultimately, that's kind of what we should want. But it's not artistic like music or literature or art or cinema, which is like almost entirely subjective in terms of like the preference or the taste. And then we can get into the is beauty objective or subjective argument if you
Hmm.
really want. And I think it's both, but it's much more difficult to see that in cultural activities. Sport is like, as you say, it's black and white. It's
Hmm.
like, did you run past the line or didn't you? Did you lift the weight? Didn't you? Did you score more goals than the other team or didn't? Like, there's this fundamental objective reality in the world of sports that does not allow us to lie. And when we attempt to lie, we are severely punished in the world of sports. Severely, just like that Serena Williams example. Oh, so she's just as good as the male pros. It's like, okay, let's see. No, not even close.
Hmm.
Not even close. There are some sports where women are better than men, though. Like there are some ultra running, like the really long distances. So not like a 100-mile race, but like a 300-mile race. Women can outperform men. Endurance swimming, women can outperform men because they actually have there's a physiological advantage in terms of their capacity to eat pain. Women have a higher pain threshold than men.
Right, right.
Sorry, guys, it's true.
How dare you, Jordan?
It's general. It's not to every individual. Biology is not a hard science. Biology is a soft science, which is
Yeah,
one of the
it's
reasons why it was so easy for the postmodernists and the Marxists and the cultural deconstructionists to move into the world of biology and be like, haha, science doesn't mean anything, people. It's like fundamental difference between a hard science and a soft science, but that's okay.
yeah, yeah. That's an interesting one. The postmodernists seem to have infected everything. It feels like I said, the pendulum may be swinging back a little bit the other way, but boy, they had a really hard run there for a bit.
They did, and it's like you can try to extend that type of an idea up until you meet the resistance. And that example I said before about like the gender wars effectively being lost in the world of sports, yeah, because eventually you will run up against reality. Eventually you will. And this is one of the reasons why I'm just such a believer in sports, because they teach us reality in a visceral way that's impossible for us to ignore once we are paying attention to it.
Yeah, I was thinking about you a lot this election cycle, believe it or not, because I think there was a bit of a referendum on some of this postmodern stuff, particularly around gendered issues, and that seemed to have been a real driver in how the election in the U.S. Played out. And I think the timing around the release of I can't remember the name of that Algerian boxer who was, I found out, actually was a biological male, had testes internally, and like it was, and everybody saw it in real time. Like you said, the reality of the situation was very visceral in the Olympics. Like people, the whole world was watching, and everybody saw, and not everybody, most people recoiled in such a visceral, physical way to that. Like this is wrong. Like this is a
Yep.
bad thing. We should not be doing this. And so I think reality has this way of, like I said, you just, there's, as much as you try, you can't escape reality. There's that great Ayn Rand quote, which is, you can ignore reality, but you can't ignore the consequences of ignoring reality.
Yes,
Uh,
love that. I love how you pointed to the Olympics too, right?
mm,
Because there was another monster revelation in terms of the sport world, and that's like the breakdancing and ray gun, right? This
mm.
Australian cultural studies ethnographer, PhD, who made a mockery of athleticism with whatever the heck that performance was, and everyone looked at it and was like, "Yo, that's not sport. What you're doing is not sport." Like you're, and people rightfully saw it as a mockery and a joke, which maybe that was her aim. All like I'm trying to put myself because I literally used to live in that world. That's the niche academic bubble. These weird sport academics, like they're very strange people. Very strange people who at once try to live by the outcomes of sports, but they're like total Marxists as well, like all the social scientists and humanities scholars are these days. So they have this weird like dissonance inside them where they really love and appreciate sport, but they kind of have to deny the truth of what sport shows.
Yeah,
it's really it's
that's
really
such a
weird.
great example, man, because I think everyone saw the performance, and same thing. It was mockery, it was derision, it was recoil, it was like, what the hell is this? And then that encounter with reality cause some more probing, some interrogation of the background. I don't know if you know the story, but apparently, since she was in charge of fielding that Australian team, she put some restrictions and some things that stopped some up and coming, minority break dancers from even making the team. So she gate kept and put herself on that pedestal, and she had that encounter with the world, and like I said, the reality one, man, that was a cool example to watch.
Academics aren't gatekeepers. What are you talking
Oh
about?
no, not at all.
What was the reality? What was the reality that she ran up against? She scored zero. She scored zero. She didn't get 1 point. That was the reality. It's like, whatever you're doing, it's not breakdancing. And likely she meant to get zero so that she could write a paper about it and then go be like a conquering hero to the 15 people that are going to go listen to her talk at some weird niche academic conference. That's in the minds of these people. In the minds of Ray Gun, it's like she won. She won. But ultimately,
she got plenty of attention.
Status and ego, bro. Gatekeeping information and knowledge. But because she did it in the world of sports, it blew up. If she had done that in like, and you see this in like Eurovision, for example. Like you see this in like the Miss America pageants where it's like a trans woman. They're like, the most beautiful woman is a man, and everyone's like, what? Okay, I guess. Like, because it's confusing, because it's like all in this subjective realm. But the second you try to pull that crap in the world of sports, you are done. You are done. Everyone saw Raygun and they saw it immediately. They're like, that is wrong. Everyone sees like the videos of the high school like boys smoking the girls in a sprint, and they're like, that's just obviously wrong. And now they're like, I'm not confused. You can't trick me with your sophistry anymore. You can't make the better argument out of the lies. I see the lies for what they are. They're right in front of me, and you can tell me I'm a bad person. You can tell me that I'm whatever, like a bigot, but I know that's not the case because I'm watching the truth play out in front of me, and now I've got courage. And it's funny that you mentioned that about the election, because one of the big issues that seemed to come to light was exactly this boys competing in girls sports. So much so that freaking like one of the mouthpieces of the establishment, John Oliver, had to make a video retorting about it. It's like, oh, these people, they didn't know. They were fooled into thinking this boys and girls sports is this big issue, and it mobilized a lot of votes, but they're stupid. It's not a big issue. It's small, and it actually boys and girls, there's no biological difference between them in sports anyways. He had to come on and he had to make a retort directly against that point. So I think you're onto something where that exposition of the lies was so profound in the world of sports, and it's a little bit of a validation on my intuition 8 years ago, basically, once I started to see what was happening. It was like, yeah, this is where you guys are going to lose. Come on. Keep going harder. Keep going harder into the world of sports, because all the other cultural areas, you guys are going to win, but there's no chance. Sports are inherently conservative in that sense. They just they promote and preserve hierarchy. Like you're not going to overtopple that in the world of sport.
Correct. And you, as you're talking through this, something really interesting emerged for me is that number one, in the two examples from the Olympics that were really impactful, you had one was an objective contest, right? Where you're actually fighting each other and there's going to be a binary winner/loser. The other one was a subjective, right? You're being graded on your performance. So in both the realms of objective and subjective, we had this sort of, like I said, same recoil effect, and this sort of like it backfired on that whole team. If I call that group of postmodernists and gender people a team. What was interesting is that in the objective contest, the winner actually lost.
Yes,
that is wild, right? The fact
people
that you had an objective
cheating,
contest. Exactly. And so they actually hurt their cause, and they ended up being in a worse position for their team in both accounts. And that was just a really interesting dynamic there.
Yeah, it's because people view that as cheating. That's why. It's like Pete Rose is the all-time leading hits leader. He just passed away. Like, he's not in the Hall of Fame. Why? Because he cheated. And once you cheat, you're excommunicated. Right? So when people see that this person won, they're like, yeah, but it's not fair. Like,
not all the time. Like we talk about the New England Patriots, man. Like they were perennial cheaters, and they still, I don't think, paid that same penalty. I think there were There was some backlash, but I don't know. I bet Belichick's going to be in the Hall of Fame. I bet Tom Brady is certainly going to be in the Hall of Fame. So not always.
That's something about professional sports, right? Professional sports are not a place for moral like example. We'll say like part of like when I talk about sport is as a moral ideal, I'm highly aware that it doesn't scale.
Mm.
The more you move any activity up, the more distant you are from the essence, and the more corrupt it's going to be. So the world of professional sports, almost by its nature, is a fallen world where morality is not even expected of the participants because it's a business, it's a spectacle, it's entertainment. So you've already made this kind of like substitution of the means and the ends in the professional world of sport. So people are more willing to look past the cheating, and especially if they think that other people are doing the same cheating. So the reason why people don't really care about the Patriots as much is because they recognize that all the other teams are likely trying to do the same thing. And it's like, well, they were just better than you guys. They were the better cheaters. And it's like the Pete Rose thing, it's like you were just betting on baseball. That's like rule number one. You can't do that. It doesn't matter.
Yep.
Like if Pete Rose was just using a little bit more pine tar in his bat than the other person, no one would care. No one would care about that cheating because they'd be like, yeah, everyone else is trying to get an advantage with pine tar. So it's like the particular kind of cheating and the particular context of the sport. It's like if I find out that the boxer has got brass knuckles under their glove, I'm not going to be very happy with that boxer. You know what I mean?
Totally. And I think there is some element to this when you start mixing commerce into the equation and you start making it more performative. You have to entertain, you have to put out a product, right? That becomes a little bit different, which is interesting. I would love to hear what you think about the sort of lowering of that bar, because there used to be college sports, for example, you couldn't pay the athletes. And so it had to be, these folks are either doing it for the love of the sport or they're trying to move into professional level. But then you look at it and it's like, well, hey, these folks are the ones that are putting their bodies on the line. They're getting lifelong injuries, CTE, blowing out knees, and they're getting not a dime. And the school administrators, are getting these hundreds of millions of dollars from ad revenue and broadcast and all this stuff. And so like that doesn't feel right to me. And so I wonder how you feel about that, because now they opened it up in the United States where the athletes actually can make some money. How do you feel about that? Do you think that that dilutes the pureness of it from a sports standpoint, or is it something different?
It's one of those like the ideal, like the actions never ever met the ideal in the first place sort of things. So like the NCAA is based off this amateur ideal, and the amateur ideal itself is like a romanticized version of what sport can and should be. And I appreciate that. I actually just wrote about this in my Substack about rescuing amateurism effectively, because the ideals I think are beautiful, but they're totally misapplied in the forms, and they've always been misapplied in the forms. And that's ultimately what happens in sport. And it's one of the big things that I've recognized about the utility of sport, and maybe this just goes to any activity, is that it's got to be related to its proper scale. And sports scale as a moral activity is local. The moment it begins to be taken outside of the local, that's when you start to get the external motivations that begin to overtake the intrinsic desire. And the people who are the amateurs, they were the worst at this, bro. It's so much so that like they were known as shamateurs. Like in the 19th century, when we look back at this golden idea or this golden era of sport, all the amateur clubs, what are they doing? They're paying players under the table. They're competing for prizes. They're trying to get the fanciest clubhouse digs by charging tickets so that it's all the same things. They're just spewing out lies, but they're acting in a way that's not congruent with what they're saying. And a lot of it was a class mechanism. Like amateurism was a particular class mechanism, particularly of the middle classes. It was a way for them to separate themselves from the lower class, but also like aspire to pull themselves up to the aristocrats. Something like no betting in sports, like that's an amateur idea. The aristocrats, the English aristocrats who kind of gave us modern sport, they wanted a fair contest so they could bet against each other. That's where cricket comes from. Cricket's like, well, we need some sort of standardized rules so I can bet against you and not have my money taken. Other wealthy landed gentry owner, you know what I mean? Yep, and then the middle class comes in and they bring their like kind of like Puritan sensibilities. It's like, no one ever gets to make money. Nobody bets. And then it's like, oh shoot, but we want to make money. And then they did. So my answer is like the NCAA was based on a lie. It was based on a myth initially. You literally like the NCAA comes out of the big three playing football, the big three schools being Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. And one of the things about the amateurs is you're not supposed to specialize. You're just supposed to sort of play the sports in their season. You train it to be excellent in them, but you don't like just hone in. So even the idea of like hiring a coach, it's like, no, that's too much because now we're kind of professional. We're specializing.
Right.
But like the students who were running these clubs, they paid coaches. They paid people to come in and instruct them before the NCAA was even created, right? And the NCAA was created in a sense to save football. Like that's the reason the reason the NCAA exists is so football could have been saved. Because it's like, just to give a little history lesson here, and I promise I won't go too deep. It's the year's 1904. Teddy Roosevelt is the president. He is a promoter of the strenuous life doctrine, which is basically just like do hard things from the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
And he was born a sickly, asthmatic, and weak child. He was removed from the city. He was taken out to like a countryside estate and was told to play sports. And that like cured him of his asthma. So he became this big believer in like the strenuous life. And, you know, he volunteered to lead a regiment in the Spanish-American War and took him to Cuba and Puerto Rico. And if anybody wants to read about that, get the Rough Riders book. It's really cool. Sorry. But Teddy Roosevelt went to Harvard and played football and became a big believer in football as this crucible, as this physical representation of the strenuous life. The problem was in the year 1904, 19 students died playing football.
Mm.
And that doesn't count the ones that were turned into paraplegics and quadriplegics because of the way that football was played at that time. It's like 20 people smashing their heads against each other.
Yep.
100 times a game. And so the people who are going to these schools in 1904, this is like the aristocracy of the United States, the upper middle class, it's the elites, and all these young boys are dying. And so people are like, no more football. And Teddy Roosevelt's like, we need football. We need it. So he calls all the presidents together of the colleges that are playing football. He says, here's what we're doing. Creates the NCAA. They change the game of football completely. This is when the forward pass was brought into the game to open it up and get away from this mass formation wedge style of game, which is just like the most vicious style of rugby you could ever play. And that's where the NCAA came from. And then they maintained this ideal of the amateur, which they had not even been practicing in the United States in football for the previous 20 years. So it was always based on an illusion. And it was always based on this like dissonance that the athletes are only doing it for money, but the colleges are getting stinking rich off the thing. Like the first major football stadiums in the United States, Harvard Bowl, Penn Bowl, the Ivy League schools, which we today are like, oh, they care about academics. And no. They're the ones that created the big football revenue funding model that now places like Alabama and Ohio State, right? Like they're just generating like millions and millions of dollars for these universities. But that's what pays for everybody else's sports. That's what pays for the brand new like science equipment. It pays for the new dorm. Like football pays for it all in the United States. So a very convoluted answer to your question, but I think it's like what was there was bad. What's here is a little bit better, but all of it is based on this sort of confusion that happens when you try to mix the moral value of sport when you scale it up into the entertainment, commerce. And it's like those two are really difficult for that to live together. It's not impossible. It's not impossible for the best athlete in the world to make the most money because they're the best, but play the game out of like the love of that comes out of their heart. That's not an impossible position. How likely is it though? It's not very likely. But if I'm just like in my own town, running my own race, volunteering like at the local level for the kids, I'm much more likely to realize those powerful moral qualities of sport because I just don't have the temptations that come once I scale it up. You know what I mean?
Or the pressures.
or the pressures. That's exactly correct. And that's not to say we shouldn't want big time sport with big time pressures and lots of spectators either. But it's about what's the spectacle and what's the drama. Like we'll go. I'd like to tie this all up here. Let's go back to the Jake Paul and Mike Tyson fight that you mentioned, because we didn't really talk about that. You're an 80s kid. You were lured in by the romance of like, I'm going to get the same type of exhilaration. I'm going to get the same type of emotion and drama that I got from a Mike Tyson fight in the late 80s and early 90s, which I saw somebody on X make a pretty good. And I kind of remember this because I'm a 90s kid, not an 80s kid, but we got a little bit of that. Certainly with like the Tyson and Lennox Lewis fights, for example. It's like, oh, Mike Tyson is fighting Saturday night. Everyone's amped up all week. Everyone's like, yeah, I'm getting ready. We're getting pumped. Whose house are we going to the pay-per-view?
Exactly.
One guy's, so it's an event. And it's like the emotion builds and the drama builds. And it's like, can he come out? Last time he smoked somebody in 30 seconds. Can he come out and knock somebody out in 15 seconds? Is this the time? Is there going to be a Buster Douglas moment? And is Mike Tyson act like there's this drama, there's this uncertainty, there's this anticipation of almost like a revelation of truth through the contest. And that's what we love about sports. But people got conned into thinking that's what was going to happen, and instead it was literally just a spectacle. It was literally just like a staged gladiator fight in ancient Rome, where they already knew who was going to die, and they just went in, and the people went there just for bloodlust. And then people who wanted the drama were like, "Yo, I'm in the wrong place. This was the bloodlust place, and I kind of wanted the drama place." And that happens a lot of times in the world of sport, where we want that romance, we want that drama, we want the mystery. Right? We want the uncertainty. We want the revelation of watching something that nobody has ever seen before and no one will ever see again in that one present moment of a live sporting event. But the world of professional sport kind of says we're going to get that every time we tune in. And that just ain't it. I love hockey, but like those like games in the middle of February where both teams don't want to be playing. It's like, I don't want to watch that. There's nothing in that for me. There's no, like, I'm willing to wait until say like the playoffs, till it means more. And then you've got the energy and the excitement and the anticipation and the uncertainty. And it's like both teams care and both cities care. And like everyone is really just interested in the quality of the performance as opposed to the spectacle. And obviously now we're talking about team sports and people are tribal. So I would say most people still aren't really getting it, but I'm never going to stop watching pro sports or big time sports. I'm just not going to be doing it all the time because I do want that. I want that inspiration. And I think that's what people really were hoping for with that Jake Paul, Mike Tyson fights. Like they wanted to feel that same thing. And then they recognized immediately, they're like, yo, this is not sport. This is not sport.
Yep, it really was WWE writ large, right? This was an entertainment. I mean, even the things of him showing his ass, like that was clearly staged. Like all the elements of this were meant, they were engineered to have mimetic value. I want to see the memes. I want to see like there's that cultural event that we all watched, and everybody hoped Tyson would knock Jake Paul out. And there's a build up to it, and there's the storylines that are interweaved, and there's all the social media stuff that springs from it. And now it's like the retrospective of the fight, showing him pulling punches, and like that's what it was all about. It wasn't actually about the sport. There was no sport there
because there was no truth.
It's fake.
And what can't be tolerated in the world of sports? Anything that's a fraud, anything that's a cheat, anything that's a misrepresentation of what it really is. And you can skate by on that image for just a little bit, but you are destroyed in the world of sports. That's why I love it. I think that's why I had to leave academia. Because even in the academic world, it's like when your people are proven wrong, especially in maybe not in the hard sciences, but say in my world of the humanities and the social sciences, the people who consistently get things wrong are the ones who keep getting promoted.
Yep. It's just terrible. I don't know how you survived academia as long as you did, man. I couldn't do it.
Well, I started fighting basically the moment I was a professor. That was how I survived and didn't survive with the whole free speech thing and then the whole mandate issue and all of it. I was a black sheep amongst black sheep in the academy, that's for sure. And I'm thankful to be on the outside, being able to talk with you and be far more intellectual and engaging and experimental and inquisitive and curious than anybody is in the academy. And how I want to end this, because this has been an open exploration into the connections of philosophy and sport, and we've gone in a lot of different directions, which I really appreciate. And for those who are listening, this is the beauty of an open-ended conversation where we don't put pressure on ourselves to come to any type of a resolution or an understanding, or oh, we got to hit this topic or that topic, right? We're in a volley, we're in a back and forth, and a beautiful back and forth. But how I want to end this, and I'll start, and then I'll kick it to you. What's something new you learned? What's something new you learned through this conversation? And something I learned from you is that idea of self sophistry that occurs in sport. That the proper way to understand the temptations that come into my brain when I want to quit is just sophistry. It's an emotional plea with the worst argument. And it's a persuasion tactic. It's not the truth. It's not the truth. And that's a really powerful frame for me to be able to take to my athletes and to my clients and to myself. I really appreciate you unearthing that gem for me in this conversation. That is a huge, huge revelation. And so I really appreciate that. And thank you for teaching me something.
Cool. Yeah. No, it just emerged through the course of the conversation, which is why we do this, man. That's the beauty of these types of conversations. I think you and I share that love. So awesome. For me, like it actually is not that I learned something like that. What I learned was I need to interrogate more my concept of the ego, right? Like I think I feel like I had a couple of things that were more on the black and white side with respect to this, and you sort of poked at this a little bit and made me open my mind to be like, you know what? This is a very complex topic that spans, like you said, evolutionary biology, and then we have there's sociology and how we interact with people in general, and status and hierarchy and self-talk and like potential past traumas you bring to this. Like there's this whole myriad of angles to explore with respect to ego, and I think I just need to take some time and think on it, and maybe do some looking at what other people have produced around the concept of ego, and make my understanding of it fuller. I think that's where I need to go next.
Love that. I love that. And as somebody who really appreciates that idea of like dissolve the ego because I want to live in a selfless way, it was also kind of a big wake up call for me to be like, but I can't get rid of it. It's part of me. Why would I want to get rid of something that's a part of me? If it's a part of me, that's got to have a positive utility. Otherwise, it would have been gone by now. Or maybe it's on the way out. Who knows?
Well, maybe it's just part of that self-mastery process, right? Like it's never, like I said, it's never going to go away. It's like, how do you polish the ego or mold the ego in a way that serves you and your family and your community in the best possible way? I think maybe that's the right way to look at it, as a process, as opposed to like, I need to, fix this next Tuesday.
Yeah. And then just to finish this off, it's like, well, what could be the process? What could be the process of properly situating the ego in our lives? It would be something like submitting to a process of truth. Submit to a process of truth, which is exactly what philosophy and sports are when done to their proper nature. Both can be misabused. I think that's also clear from this conversation. It's not like,
for sure,
oh, these are great things that once you do them, they're only ever going to do good things in the world. It's like, no. We're humans, and we created these things so they could be tilted towards good or bad. They're almost like neutral in a sense, right? And it's the intention of the heart that's going to determine the good or the bad of any of these things. So the final thing is not a resolution in terms of an outcome, but a resolution into doubling down into this idea of process, living by a process that brings you directly into contact with truth as often as possible. That's why we should train. That's why we should compete. That's why we should think. I appreciate you, Brent. I know this will not be our last conversation, probably
Hell
on my
no.
platform or your platform. And we were talking before we hit record about doing a race together next year. And maybe we could do a live philosophy podcast or something like
Oh,
that.
hell yeah. I am so down for that.
All right. Making plans, making future aims. Thank you, everybody, for listening. This has definitely been the longest podcast, but I want to have these longer, drawn out conversations as an exposition into this ideal of process and the curiosity and creativity and imagination that Brent and I have brought to this discussion. I want you to bring that into your training and your competing and the way you move your body too. So let's go. Philosophy, sport, truth.
Let's go.
Appreciate you. Appreciate everybody listening. We'll catch you in the next one.